So basically, all growth, natural forest, end up getting replaced by monoculture plantations. And these are forests that have only one type of tree species. They are just cultivated for timber, harvesting for different reasons, including biomass. Unfortunately, short-term economic profits wins over biodiversity sustainability. International carbon accounting standards are a tricky thing. Basically, these rules that all countries have to follow count biomass emissions as zero in the energy sector because...
Welcome to the first episode of our podcast, SFOCify, where we talk about climate change and the energy transition in Asia. Today, Eleonora and I will talk all about forests and the issues that they face due to unsustainable energy production. But first, Eleonora, could you please introduce yourself?
Yep. Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Eleonora. I work as a program officer for the Forest and Land Use team at SFOC, supporting forest and biodiversity conservation.
Let's start by explaining how forests and energy production are linked. Can you explain to me what biomass actually is?
Sure. In the context of energy production, woody biomass refers to trees and woody plants that are burned to generate heat and electricity. But on a large scale, this type of energy source is actually unsustainable.
Why would this be unsustainable? Because isn't biomass a renewable energy source since the trees will just grow back?
Yeah, actually, trees will grow back, obviously, but the emissions from burning the trees affects the climate immediately, while the capture by new trees of carbon would span throughout several years, if ever. This is because it's not always the case that trees will grow back, first of all, because in clear-cut areas, these are areas where trees have been wiped out. In many instances, these are left bare as they are, or they become roads or farms. And actually, even when replanting is done to a clear-cut area, often is done without considering the original ecosystem and the original forest. So basically, all growth, natural forest, end up getting replaced by monoculture plantations. And these are forests that have only one type of tree species. And basically, they are just cultivated for timber, harvesting for different reasons, including biomass. So these are basically plantations and forests with a very short lifespan and are aimed for commercial use. And because of this, they don't absorb as much carbon sink as the original and old growth forest. And yeah, this basically leads to a loss of precious carbon sinks that have been, because they are centuries old forests and have once stored vast amounts of carbon over the years, and are then replaced with very short rotation plantations that capture far less carbon over time. And that's not the only thing, the carbon capture. They actually harm also, this shift to monoculture plantation actually harms biodiversity and the livelihood of the local communities. I would like to give you an example, actually. There's different studies that find that how monoculture plantation increases the risk of wildfires. Basically, this is because in the case of these plantations, and especially with conifers, so like pine trees, these may become really flammable. They have a high wildfire risk. And this is because pines or conifers they produce a lot of needles. They produce resin, which gets accumulated and becomes very flammable over time. And to give you a specific example, let's say Indonesia. In the case of plantation in Indonesia, so when rainforests are converted into industrial monoculture plantations to extract timber, it's not just the planting of non-native trees. There's also the fact that the humid peatlands where the original forests were rooted get dried. They actually dried up these peatland to grow these type of plantations. And so this process not only releases the carbon that was stored in these peatlands that has been there for centuries, but it also, again, creates highly flammable and dried material like leaves and debris. And this has been shown that it has led to an increased number of wildfires in those regions. But really, as we saw recently, not just an issue with rainforests, because just until a couple of weeks ago, South Korea has suffered the worst wildfires that the country has ever seen. And this is also due to the reason I just mentioned about monoculture plantation.
It sounds like this is not really a solution to climate change, so we don't really have time to waste on this sort of false solution. And even if we were to say that biomass could be perfectly carbon neutral in, say, 100 years' time, it doesn't really matter for the climate reality that we're facing today. As shown in this graph by Robbie Andrew, the longer we take to bring down emissions, the more sharply it needs to be done in order to avoid hitting the so-called climate tipping points. These are emissions thresholds beyond which climate change impacts will become uncontrollable and in a way that we cannot expect. So just saying that trees will grow back and recapture the emissions that we emitted from burning biomass, though it might be not untrue in the grand scheme of things, it's a moot point when we need emissions to decrease today. What's more, burning biomass actually emits more CO2 than coal, I've discovered, since the high water content of the wood means that you get less energy per unit burned. And this is actually why mankind started using other fuels hundreds of years ago. But if forest biomass is unsustainable and actually more polluting than fossil fuels, why is it considered zero emissions in the energy sector?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is fairly simple. It all comes down that international carbon accounting standards are a tricky thing. So basically, these rules that all countries have to follow count biomass emissions as zero in the energy sector because they assume the carbon emissions are already accounted in the agricultural sector, so when the trees are harvested. And basically, these carbon accounting rules end up making burning trees look clean. And actually, as you said, even though this whole process releases more CO2 than fossil fuels. And yeah, it really should go without saying that burning anything and burning especially precious carbon sink on a large scale is a bad thing for the climate and for the environment. But here we are. Due actually to these accounting rules, countries around the world have been pouring a lot of money into biomass, though, this is obviously wrong. And this is done through subsidy schemes and has been done for years. But this, ironically, shifts away resources from real clean energy to this fake solution. And this really shows how, unfortunately, short-term economic profits wins over biodiversity sustainability.
That's a pretty funny logic that if you take the emissions that would have been accounted to this biomass burning for the energy sector and just put them somewhere else, all of a sudden it looks very clean as an energy source. That's a very interesting way to look at it. Thank you for your explanation. Now we'll go on to another topic. So how is this issue actually linked with South Korea and more generally with Asia, which we talk about on this podcast?
Yeah. South Korea is actually the third highest importer for woody biomass. And before that, the second highest importer is Japan. The first one is actually the UK. These countries rely on forest-rich countries for their fuel. So they import it. Most of the fuel is imported from forest-rich countries. And the market in these countries is also increasing. The biomass market in this country is also increasing due to these subsidies programs that Japan and South Korea have. And this further fuels deforestation around the world. So, as I said, they're importing from forest-rich countries, and this means that Korea and Japan are destroying precious forest ecosystem for the sake of, again, this fake renewable energy. Korea actually imports most of its biomass, wood biomass, from different areas that have precious carbon sinks and forests. And there's the rainforests in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia. And then there's also the boreal forests of Canada, the US, and Russia. This means basically that Korea, but also Japan, for that matter, in addition to their domestic biomass policies and destroying the ecosystem in their own country, import deforestation without actually being accounted for it. And this increases Korea's and Japan's ecological footprint even more. I would like to give you some figures, actually. In Korea, this fake renewable biomass, woody biomass, accounts for 27% of renewable energy supply. And it's only second to solar power. And similarly, in Japan, biomass accounts for 34% of their renewable energy. And so I think these figures highlight how much these subsidies have had repercussions in the whole market of renewable energy, right? Because they have distorted it. A lot of that money went into biomass, which is, again, what we call a fake renewable, rather than other clean solutions like wind or solar. And I think we really must shift away from this strong belief that large-scale biomass and large-scale burning of wood is okay, because it's not, as we saw. And it has been proved again and again that is not carbon neutral, and how big of the industries are having around the world, not just on the climate change side, but also on the biodiversity, because clear-cutting forests and monoculture plantations have very dire effects on ecosystem, biodiversity, and the ecosystem services. And then, again, in conclusion and continuing on with that, also with forest fires, and so impacting the life of the people that live in those areas.
Sure. Thanks for your time, Eleonora. After what you've shared today, I can't believe biomass is still being sold as a renewable, clean energy source. It's more polluting than coal, increases risks of wildfires, destroys natural habitats, and isn't even renewable in any sense of the word. And so let's acknowledge the truth about biomass and instead invest in true renewable and carbon neutral energy sources like wind and solar. Thank you, everyone, and see you again next time.